Hey everyone, this is Oscar from Underdog, and today I want to ask you a mega important question. And the question is, what is your workflow for referencing while you produce music? What this video is really about is, first, I want you to understand why referencing is crucial and why it's one of your main tools for getting better at music production in general. And then secondly, I want to show you how to do it, because understanding why it's important is not enough. You actually have to get the habit of doing it. And even when I teach classes, I can explain to people why it's important. They say, yeah, I understand. And then 6 months later, I ask them, how do you reference? And they're like, oh, I just never reference. So first, let's talk about why it's important. And secondly, let's talk about how to do it. Because at the end of this video, I want you to have no freaking excuses for not referencing anymore. Okay? So let's get into it. Before we go any further, if you want to help the channel grow, like the video, subscribe, and hit the little bell icon. If you want to learn more about music production in a structured way, go have a look at my Foundations of Electronic Music course on courses.underdog.brussels, and come meet the other producers on our Discord channel as well. And a big thank you to the sponsor of today, Reason Studios. They make it possible for me to bring you this educational content in several DAWs. So very nice. Now let's get into it. So why is referencing even important? Well, see if you recognize this story from your own experience. So you go into your music making software and you start programming some of the elements that you think the music that you would like to make has. So imagine you're trying to make techno and you're like, okay, 1 kick drum, 2 kick drums, 3 kick drums, 4 kick drums. Let's put them on a loop. Okay, what else should I add? What are there? There are more drums, there are more synthesizers. Maybe I'll add some synthesizers. Maybe I'll add some more synthesizers. Maybe I'll add some more drums. You keep adding stuff, and then you zoom out. Like you go away, for instance, you go have a cup of tea, you come back into your studio and you play what you've made. And then you actually play some actual techno and you're like, whoa, what I did has almost nothing to do with that. That's a completely different vibe, a completely different atmosphere. It's completely different. Even though when I started to make something, I thought I wanted to make techno. This applies to any genre, of course, right? But the problem is that the tools are guiding you in some kind of direction that if it's not clear in your mind where you want to go, you're going to be led in some kind of random direction, ending up with some kind of random sound world. This applies both in terms of creative decisions and in terms of mixdown decisions. And one of the anecdotes that always stuck with me was this silly game that my dad would play. He would go up to a random person and hand them a sheet of paper and a pen and say, draw a bicycle. And ask them, like, do you know what a bicycle looks like? And people would be like, yes, I know what a bicycle looks like. And then he would hand them a pen and a paper and say, well, then draw one. And people would create the most insane looking constructions, because a bicycle, unless you actually have the hobby of regularly working with bicycles visually, most people aren't actually necessarily super aware of how all the pieces of a bicycle connect with each other. And so you end up with this random constellation of like triangles and nonsense from people who thought that they knew how to draw a bicycle. And so it seems to be that a bicycle is just a little bit too complex for most of us to actually clearly have it in our mind what that looks like. And the same goes for music. Music is very multidimensional and quite complicated, and our memory is not very great. It's very easy for us to get used to a particular kind of sound world while we're producing that diverges quite strongly from where we want to end up. We're very subjective, we're not very objective. We're automatically seduced by what we're making in the moment, and so we can get used to that. And so how do we snap out of that subjectivity? Like, has it ever happened to you that you put some kind of weird effect on your master and left it on and continued to produce, forgetting that that was on the master? And so you start making all sorts of crazy decisions. Like, for instance, you might put a low pass filter on your master because you wanted to check how your low end sounded, for instance, and you left it on accidentally. And then you end up going back into your production and working like that for like hours without realizing that you were losing the entire top end of your track. This kind of subjectivity can lead you down a lot of dead ends, and there is a way to get out of it, and that is referencing. Referencing is your number one way to regain objectivity, to be able to step back, look at what you've made, and look at other things that sound more correct, let's call it, and say, okay, my thing in relation to these other tracks has too much high end, not enough high end, too boring programmed hi-hats, not enough programmed hi-hats, too much going on in the high end. Suddenly, you can see in relationship to other tracks what really is going on in your track. You could almost see it as the number one way of giving yourself feedback on your track. You have access to an infinite number of reference tracks that you can compare to your track, and each one of those reference tracks is going to teach you something about your track. And that doesn't mean that you have to copy the reference track. It just gives you objectivity so that then you know something more about your track, objectively, not subjectively. Okay, so let's imagine now that I've convinced you that referencing is important. How would you go about actually doing that? Well, what you want to do first of all is get yourself some reference tracks. What makes a good reference track? Well, first of all, you want something that is professionally mixed and mastered. So let's get a track from an artist that you respect and that is established in the industry where you would like to release music. Imagine if your song was going to be played in a DJ set or on a radio show back to back with other songs. What are those other songs? Those would be your reference tracks. Now you go out and you buy those reference tracks. Do not rip them from YouTube. Do not rip them from streaming services. You don't know what kind of processing has gone on after the track was mastered. No, you want the track as close to the studio version that the artist released as possible. So you want to go to their Bandcamp, that's the best one, Beatport if necessary, although I'm not crazy about their business model, or even the Apple Music Store or wherever you can buy the song. And so buy it. It just costs $1, and you're then going to keep that file inside of a folder called reference tracks forever. So just do yourself that favor. And so once you've got this track, what you need to do is you need to put yourself in the position where you can hit a button and instantly switch between your track and the reference track. Not almost instantly, not like stop, start. No, you want to be instantly switching. You want to go from one to the other, because in the 2 seconds that your ear has the silence, you're already losing objectivity. And then when you hit that button, when you switch from yours to the reference track, what you preferably want is that you and the reference track are set to the same loudness, subjectively speaking. And in most situations, I would argue that if you can get your track and the reference track bouncing around the same RMS value, that's where you want to be. Check out this video to understand the difference between peak volume and RMS volume, but very briefly, peak volume is the loudest point of the signal, but RMS value is like the average volume of the signal over the past half a second or so. And RMS is a very good indicator of what we subjectively perceive as loudness. So if you and the reference track are at the same RMS, you're not going to be tricked into thinking that the reference track is better because it's just louder. And that's the main threat here in this situation, is that you're going to reference to a reference track, it's going to sound louder, and you're going to get discouraged because you're going to think that yours sounds worse. That's not a fair comparison. You always have to make sure that the relative loudness is set to the same level, so that then what you're paying attention to is the creative decisions and the balanced decisions. Do you have too much low end compared to the high end or not? These kind of decisions become very clear once you're at the same RMS volume. Okay, so let's assume that I've convinced you that referencing is important and you'd like to actually hop into your DAW and do it, right? But it's not super obvious how to do it because most DAWs don't integrate this as a core feature. So we have to set up a workflow for ourselves, but it's not impossible. Let's have a look at some workflows together right now in Ableton and in Reason. Let's hop into Ableton right now and get busy. Okay, so imagine I'm in my DAW working on a project, kind of like this. Okay, so this is a collaborative project with a friend of mine called Anton. Hopefully we'll get it released in the next few months. But I've been working on it for a while now and I've lost objectivity. So like I said, we want to get into a position where at just one touch of a button, I switch between my track and a reference track, and we want to do so at the same RMS value. So my workflow for this, the most simple and straightforward workflow, is to take all of my tracks here. So I take every single track that's in this composition and I group them. I group everything to go into this one big group, which I call the Oscar Master. Oscar because it's my name, and Master because we're going to treat this as if it's the master channel. The real master channel down here, we're going to leave it as transparent as possible. No processing on there at all. At the most, we can put on some monitoring plugins there or some analysis plugins there, but nothing that actually affects the sound. What I want to create is a situation where the sound that's coming out of this Oscar Master is the sound of my song, including everything to do with mixdown, including all the mastering plugins. Everything that is my song comes out of this Oscar Master. And then I can collapse this Oscar Master, create an audio track right next to it, and call this the reference track. I can disable this track And then when I hit solo, I'll switch from the Oscar master to the reference track immediately. And so this way I can A/B test, because I'll go from my track as I intended it to the reference track as they intended it. And then I'm going to start noticing various things. Let me, for instance, go now to my reference folder. I have here a folder of mix references right here that I like to use for these kind of things. And in this case, melodic house and techno, I'm going to go for maybe a Tale of Us track. All right, I'm going to bring that up here. Now, probably because I have to play a little bit of this on YouTube, we might get this video demonetized, hopefully not unpublished though. So anyway, so I placed the song here on a place where the beat is playing. Don't compare a beat section to a break section, right? You want a beat section to be compared to a beat section. And so what we'll do is, immediately before we even listen to it, we're going to go into session view and we're going to look at the volume meters. And remember that there's two types of volume. There's a transparent green, which is the peak volume, and then there's the fuller green, which is the RMS volume. And so what we're going to see is that the RMS of our track is bouncing around a certain number. We make a note of that number, and then we go into the reference track and we just bring down the volume until it's bouncing around the same number. Then we've compensated for any kind of mastering that they've done on the reference track, and we'll get a better impression of the mix balance. So let's hit play. Okay, so our RMS is bouncing around -6, and actually so is theirs. Because I've done already a kind of a self-mastering here myself, I've actually already got a pretty healthy loudness to the track. But imagine if the RMS of our track was bouncing around -18. Let's just for comparison's sake, say that your RMS is bouncing around -12 and the reference track is bouncing around -6. Then when you switch between them, notice how awful this feels. You know, yours feels dark, muffled, quiet compared to the reference track because it's simply louder. And we're very sensitive to loudness to the point where we say that subjectively it always sounds better. So to compensate for this, we could bring down the reference track until it sits next to ours, bouncing around -12 in the full bar. And then, there we go. Okay, now we can start noticing things. You can notice some things about the mix down. For instance, the amount of sub bass in the reference track is much higher than mine. And that might be okay. The point of a reference track is not that you have to imitate it. The point of the reference track is that you can objectively learn stuff about your track and then ask yourself the question if you're okay with that. Maybe I don't want mine to be as subby as this reference track. Maybe I like the way that it's a bit more punchy. So this is the simplest A/B referencing workflow that I can possibly think of, and it has some downsides. The biggest downside that you're going to see here is that with this workflow, your sends and returns are not included in your track like this. So that on this Oscar master, I'm actually doing my self-mastering, but then these returns are added afterwards in the signal chain. And that doesn't make any sense. You don't want that. You want normally that your sends and returns are added back into the signal path before it hits any mastering plugins. So as a consequence of this workflow being the smoothest workflow for me, I've just stopped using sends and returns, which is definitely not best practices, but that's what's been working for me mostly. You can get around this with a different workflow though, and that involves using a plugin like MCompare. There's a plugin called MCompare, which you can drag into your master. And then on your master, what you've got is a number of different files that you can load in. For instance, let me load in a few different files. Let me choose a section for them to start where there's actually a beat playing and a bit of a melody. And the magic of this plugin is that you can hit this ALC, which is like an automatic level matching, which means it's automatically going to detect the volume of the signal coming in and just automatically balance the RMS compared to each other. I think it's the RMS. I'm not 100% sure, but either way, the subjective loudness gets set to the same level. And so when you A/B test against them, it's a very smooth experience. So for instance, this is our track. And back to our track. So for instance, something this is telling me is that our track doesn't have a whole lot of high mids, not a lot of freshness up in the, like let's say maybe 3000 hertz range, at least compared to Stefan Jolk. and compare it to this one. This one is more subby than we are. So going back and forth between these reference tracks and this track teaches me where my track is. Is this a healthy place for my track to be? Maybe. Maybe I like it being a little bit less subby and a little bit less bright than the reference tracks. Another cool thing to do with this is that you can also map this, for instance, here in Ableton, this selected. You can edit MIDI map and use a MIDI controller like this, just with some faders. I'm going to move one of the faders and you're going to see it show up there on the selected on the bottom left. So I would just need to set the minimum and the maximum here so that when I move this, that I'm selecting the 3 different tracks. So let me turn off the MIDI selection here. You'll see that when I move this leftmost fader, I've now selected the first track, then the second track, then the third track. So I can have this on the desk next to me and just go pull down, push up, pull down, push up. And so let me just do that in practice. Not use my eyes, but use my ears instead. Yeah, mine definitely would need a little bit of more energy in the upper mids if it were to be mixed into a DJ set, so that it wouldn't feel muted compared to the other ones. Yeah, and that's it. So referencing has just helped me out immensely. It has helped me learn how to listen better, and it has given me feedback on my track. Wonderful. Let me show you how you would do this in Reason as well. Okay, so here we are in Reason. Do not be intimidated by the chaotic looking interface. What you have to imagine, first of all, is that all of these racks, this middle section over here, is just hidden. We're not going to talk about that right now. What we're going to do instead is we're going to first look at this arrangement view. Look at this. This is a track that I've been working on. I was working on this yesterday. It's a kind of a hypnotic techno track. And so the mix down of a hypnotic techno track is very important. Like the details of the mix are very important. So what I'll do is I'll take a section where the beat is playing and where a lot of different elements are playing. For instance, I'll select these 4 bars here, do Control L on my Windows computer, and I'll hit play. Okay, cool. So this is what I was working on, right? And so now let me hit F5 on the keyboard, which will bring me to the mix desk view. Woof, here. Okay, so now I'm walking over to the mix desk, and here I can see vertically per channel each of the most important elements in front of me. And I can do a mix down on them. But then all of these together, they run into something called the master inserts, which is just a bunch of effects that you want everything to go through. For example, one of the most common ones is that at the end of your signal chain, you want a limiter to be able to control the volume of your overall song. And so in Reason, what you have to do is go over here to the right, and where it says master inserts, you hit edit inserts. Make sure it's not bypassed. Now, this brings us back into the rack view, and we're just going to have to clean up a little bit our interface. So to remove the browser on the left, we hit F3, hop, and to remove the one on the top, we hit F6 because we want to focus on the rack. Hop. Now, okay, we're focused on the rack. This again is a visual mess because I've worked on this for a whole day and I kind of know how it all fits together. Kinda. But so on the top left is where we're going to find the master inserts. And I'll move over here. And this up here is the master section. And under the master section, we're going to see a couple of things. First of all, we're going to see an equalizer, a stereo imager, a compressor, and a maximizer, which is the default mastering or self-mastering chain that Reason provides. That's awesome. That's definitely what we want. This is the last treatment of our song before it gets rendered, let's say. Then after that, I've got 3 plugins. I've got MCompare, which we just saw in Ableton as well. I've got my SonarWorks as the last thing. And I've also got this small speaker simulator. And due to the way that I've set this up, the MCompare runs into the small speaker simulator and the small speaker simulator runs into the SonarWorks. Think of your signal chain like this. First, you want your entire song to be mixed. Then, on the master, you want to go into any creative effects. Then after that, you want to go into any mastering effects. Then after that, you want to go into any comparison effects, like this MCompare. Then you want to go into your analysis tools. So anything like metering plugins, isotope insight, or even filters just if you want to listen to only the low end for a while or something like this. In this case, the small speaker simulator, for instance, where I just roll off the lows and the highs. And then finally, any monitoring effects that are technically somehow part of your speakers, like the SonarWorks right here. And I've even used this combinator here to create a control, which is going to select the different MCompare elements. So here I've got MCompare, I'm going to keep it open. And when I move this dial up here, hop, select the 3 different references. So when I hit play, this is me. It's a reference, and a reference. And me again. And again, they're auto level matched, and I can map them to a MIDI controller so that when I move it up, look at that, over it goes, up and down. I've mapped this control number 5 up here to the different selectors over here. This might all seem really nerdy and really complicated, but trust me, I'm not going to repeat everything that I said in the intro. This is the #1 way to get better at music production and to be sure that what you're doing is actually improving the music, not just changing it. It's a way for you to be confident that you're getting closer to your musical goals, because your ears can't lie to you if you recalibrate them all the time. As I was working on this and discovering all the different things that I could do with this Reason rack, I got the idea that maybe it would be good to save a template for me next time so I wouldn't have to do all this routing. When I start a new track based on my template, this is what I see. What I've done is I've replaced all the controls on this combinator with just the 3 controls that I want. I want to select my 3 different references. I want to turn on and off my small speaker simulator, which is just a low pass filter and a high pass filter on one of these channel EQs. And I want to turn on and off my Sonar Works with 1 click. That's literally everything that I want. And then during the production, I'm going to go into these yellow plugins over here and turn on the maximizer probably first, then maybe mess a bit with the compressor, the stereo imager, and the equalizer before it goes into the maximizer. But basically, these are my mastering plugins. And this is my comparison plugin, this is my analysis plugin, and this is my monitoring plugin. Any kind of other analysis plugins like Isotope Insight, I would put before this one right here and after MCompare right here. So it's good to get this idea clear in your head of why different things would be on your mastering for any particular reason. So there you have it. Whatever software you use, find yourself a workflow for referencing. You will thank yourself. Make it effortless. Make it super easy for you to reference with reference tracks. And before you know it, you're going to be getting more consistent, more confident, and better produced tracks. If you want to learn more essential foundations like this, check out my Foundations of Electronic Music course. Come say hi on our Discord channel. And until next time, stay producing, be good to one another, and take care. Bye-bye.